Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Thanks to our listeners in Germany, Singapore, Switzerland, the USA, and Venezuela. It's episode 37. Let's get into it.
This week, we've got the stories that didn't make the front page, but probably should have. A new Fed chair made his debut, and what he said between the lines was more interesting than the headline rate decision. And a study out of a major medical conference found something that nobody expected from Ozempic users. Spoiler, they're sitting more, not less. We've also got a breakthrough in destroying forever chemicals using nothing but UV light and water. A Swedish materials lab just quietly extended the reach of superconductivity. On the lighter side, or maybe the heavier side, depending on how you read it, 80% of U.S. hotels are tracking below projections for the World Cup. And the internet has decided that 2016 was better. We'll unpack what that actually means. For the week ahead, Micron reports earnings Wednesday, the Colombia presidential runoff is Sunday, and the May PCE lands Thursday. That's a lot of signal in 5 days. Wake Up Ready has the full weather report.
The thread underneath all of it is the same one it always is: what you see and what you don't. Let's go find the second one.
Let's go.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Kevin Warsh sat down at the Federal Reserve's podium for the first time on Wednesday and spent 43 minutes telling you exactly what kind of Fed chair he plans to be. The headline, rates held at 3.5 to 3.75% for the fourth meeting in a row, wasn't the story. The story was everything that surrounded it. Warsh is the 17th Fed chair in the institution's history. He was confirmed by the Senate in May by a vote of 54 to 45, the most divisive confirmation in Federal Reserve history. He was 45 years old when he was sworn in, and for the past 15 years, he's been publicly on record saying, in almost exactly these words, "Inflation is a choice." At his first press conference, he said it again. He wants a narrower Fed. Less communication, more discipline, less guidance about what it might do, and more focus on what it's actually doing. The market saw this as hawkish. The committee's projections now raise the odds of a rate hike later this year, not a cut. That's a meaningful pivot from where we were 90 days ago, when 1 or 2 cuts by December were still the market consensus. Warsh is essentially telling you the era of "we're watching carefully" is over. In its place, the era of "we told you what we're watching for." For investors, that shift has downstream consequences. Duration risk reprices when the Fed gets more predictably hawkish. And if Warsh actually delivers on the institutional reform he's signaled, less Fed speak, fewer forward guidance signals, every market participant who built a strategy around interpreting the Fed's tone is going to have to recalibrate. The reason this surfaced with such clarity this week, it was his first meeting. Not a test run, an actual debut. And he passed the audition for the people who hired him, while unsettling the people who weren't expecting a pivot this fast.
Jerome Powell spent 4 years threading needles. Warsh just picked up the needle and said he'd rather use scissors.
The IPO window that SpaceX blew open last week has 2 more mega tests ahead, and this week, the race between them got considerably more concrete. Anthropic filed a confidential S-1 with the SEC on June 1st, targeting a valuation of approximately $965 billion. To understand what that number is sitting on, Anthropic's annualized revenue was $9 billion in January. By May, it was running at $47 billion. That's a 5 times increase in 5 months. OpenAI filed its own confidential S-1 days after Anthropic. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley are split across the 2 underwriting rosters. The consensus timing for both offerings is Q4 2026, with Anthropic targeting October. The sequencing matters because of what it does to valuation precedent. The company that goes first sets the revenue multiple against which the second gets measured. Anthropic is racing to establish that framework before OpenAI can. OpenAI would prefer to be the benchmark rather than be evaluated against one someone else set. For the investment banks, this is a scheduling problem as much as a financial one. The 2 largest tech IPOs in history can't land in the same 2-week window without cannibalizing demand. Someone has to blink first. What makes the sequencing consequential beyond the 2 companies? The combined anticipated raise for these two offerings exceeds $160 billion. SpaceX raised $75 billion and was the largest IPO in history. The million retail investors who bought SPCX in the first hours of trading are now making a decision: hold a company at a $2 trillion valuation or sell and wait for the next two. That behavior, aggregated across 1 million accounts, is the leading indicator for how the AI company IPO window actually prices. The Anthropic story gained a second wave of attention this week as analysts began mapping the sequencing conflict with OpenAI, giving it concrete capital market structure that the original confidential filing lacked.
Two companies racing to set the valuation ceiling. The other will be judged against. Only one gets to go first.
That same pattern, something not working the way the optics suggested it should, shows up in tariff data that came into sharper focus this week. The conventional narrative around tariffs is that they protect domestic producers and redirect demand toward American-made goods. The data tells a more complicated story. Research tracking retail pricing since October 2024 has found that the cheapest product varieties, the store brands, the value tiers, the bottom-of-shelf options, saw prices rise an average of 5%. Premium equivalents rose about 2.5% over the same period. The average American household is now paying approximately $1,500 more per year as a direct result of the current tariff regime, which the Yale Budget Lab has called the largest tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. The mechanism isn't difficult to understand once you see it. Luxury goods are often domestically manufactured or sourced from countries with different tariff rates. Value goods are overwhelmingly imported from China and Southeast Asia, which is precisely the supply chain the tariffs were designed to hit. So the tariff pass-through is heaviest exactly where lower-income households shop. Furnishings, clothing, and electronics are the hardest-hit categories. Clothing is particularly regressive because lower-income households spend a higher share of their income on apparel than higher-income households do. So the same price increase lands harder. The Dallas Fed published analysis this week showing that tariff effects on PCE prices peaked in the first quarter of 2026 and are now flowing into real-time retail data. That gave the pricing story new empirical weight and pushed it back into financial press after a few months of relative quiet. The story isn't new, but the confirmation that it's embedded in the price level now is.
A tax that costs more when you have less isn't trade policy, it's just policy.
Another story gaining momentum this week, and another case of something working differently than expected. People taking GLP-1 medications are losing weight and moving significantly less while they do it. A study presented at ENDO 2026, the Endocrine Society's annual meeting in Chicago, analyzed Fitbit data from 753 adults with obesity who were prescribed GLP-1 drugs like semaglutide, dulaglutide, or tirzepatide, the class that includes Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro. The finding: average daily steps dropped from 5,047 to 4,487 after starting the medications. That's a loss of 560 steps per day. Moderate to vigorous activity dropped by nearly 6 minutes daily. The declines were steepest among men and among people with musculoskeletal pain. The hypothesis going in was intuitive, almost assumed. You lose weight, you feel better, you move more. The feedback loop seemed obvious. But what appears to be happening is closer to the opposite. The appetite suppression is so effective that the body is consuming dramatically fewer calories, and the biological response is to conserve energy by reducing spontaneous movement. That's not laziness. That's physiology. The clinical stakes are real. GLP-1 drugs don't just reduce fat mass, they reduce lean muscle mass too. When you simultaneously reduce caloric intake through appetite suppression and reduce physical activity through this energy conservation response, you risk losing the very muscle and bone density that give weight loss its long-term health dividend. The researchers aren't saying don't use these drugs. They're saying the drug without a structured exercise protocol may be delivering a narrower form of health improvement than we thought. This got significant attention this week because the Fitbit data gave it unusual credibility. It measured actual behavior, not self-reported activity, and the sample size was large enough to carry statistical weight.
The drug works exactly as intended, and that's the problem.
That same pattern, finding what was hiding in the chemistry, surfaces in a very different context. Scientists published research this week revealing that intense ultraviolet light can destroy PFAS compounds, the so-called forever chemicals found in everything from non-stick pans to municipal water supplies, without any added chemical reagents. Here's how it works. When water is exposed to high-energy UV light, specifically at wavelengths below 300 nanometers, the energy generates hydrogen radicals from the water molecules themselves. Those radicals are highly reactive, and when they encounter PFAS compounds, they attack the molecular bonds that make PFAS so persistent. In a 5-hour laboratory test, one key PFAS compound called GenX degraded by 49%. That's not full destruction, but it's meaningful, and it's happening without any chemical input beyond light and water. The researchers at the University of New South Wales, where this work originated, are careful to note that scaling this from a lab environment to a municipal water treatment plant is a significant engineering leap. But the underlying mechanism is now understood in a way it wasn't before. And that distinction matters. If you know exactly what's driving the degradation, you can design systems to maximize it. The stakes are considerable. PFAS contamination affects an estimated 200 million Americans, according to the Environmental Working Group. Cleanup efforts have been chronically underfunded, partly because effective treatment methods have been prohibitively expensive and technically complex. A scalable approach that requires nothing but a UV lamp and contaminated water would fundamentally shift the economics of remediation from how do we manage this problem to how quickly can we reverse it.
200 million people drinking contaminated water, and the solution was in the water the whole time.
Which brings us to another materials science story getting attention this week. This one out of Sweden, and with implications that stretch from MRI machines to quantum computers. Researchers at Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg published findings showing that by subtly sculpting the surface beneath an ultra-thin superconducting material, changing the texture of the substrate it sits on, they could make that material maintain its superconducting state at higher temperatures and under much stronger magnetic fields. Both of those are enormous barriers in practical superconductor design. To understand what's at stake here, superconductivity is the state in which a material conducts electricity with zero resistance. For most materials, it only occurs near absolute zero, well below -200 Celsius. The holy grail of materials science for decades has been finding materials that superconduct at higher temperatures, ideally at room temperature or ambient conditions. Earlier this year, a team at the Texas Center for Superconductivity broke the record for the highest superconducting temperature at ambient pressure, 151 Kelvin, or roughly -122 Celsius. Still extremely cold by human standards, but a 30-year record. The Chalmers work isn't a temperature record, it's a durability record. A superconductor that can hold its state under physical and magnetic stress is a superconductor you can actually build something around. MRI machines, maglev trains, power transmission grids, and quantum computers all depend on superconducting materials. And the cost and fragility of maintaining those materials under operating conditions is one of the main reasons these technologies haven't scaled faster. If substrate engineering turns out to be generalizable, if you can apply this approach to other superconducting materials, the practical consequences compound significantly. The paper hit Science Daily on June 17th and is already circulating in quantum computing and semiconductor research communities where substrate engineering is a live commercial problem.
We've been trying to make the superconductor stronger. Turns out the fix was what it was sitting on.
Moving to trade, and a confrontation that's been building quietly for months and is about to get louder this week. The European Union is moving toward the most consequential trade action against China since the steel tariffs of 2018, and the country with the most to lose isn't France or Italy, it's Germany. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is expected this week to outline new EU trade defense tools specifically targeting low-cost Chinese goods entering European markets. The immediate focus is electric vehicles. EU officials have been investigating whether Chinese EV manufacturers, BYD, SAIC, and Geely among them, are pricing their vehicles in ways that reflect state subsidies rather than market economics. Beijing has already responded before the formal announcement. If the EU implements new mechanisms, China will take retaliatory measures. Here's why Germany is caught in the middle in a way that's structurally uncomfortable. BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes generate between 25 and 35% of their revenues in China. Beijing's preferred retaliatory tool isn't a blanket tariff on European goods. It's targeted measures against the sectors most politically exposed to the relationship. A 30% Chinese import tariff on European luxury vehicles would hit German auto harder and faster than any broad trade restriction. That gives Berlin a direct financial incentive to lobby Brussels toward restraint, which is exactly what's been happening in internal EU negotiations for months. The second-order dynamic is this. The EU's historical restraint toward China on trade has been partly a function of German economic interests, serving as a brake inside the Union. That brake is losing friction. If the Commission moves forward with formal trade defense mechanisms over German objections, it signals something significant about whether Berlin's weight inside Brussels is shifting. The formal recommendation from the Commission is expected this week, making this the actual inflection point, not commentary on a trend.
Germany built the best cars in the world. Now those cars are also Beijing's most useful lever.
And in the Western Hemisphere, on Sunday, Colombia holds its presidential runoff. It's one of the most closely watched elections in South America this year, and the outcome directly affects how one of the region's largest economies manages its energy policy and its relationship with Chinese capital. The first round on May 31st produced a tighter-than-expected result. Right-wing political outsider Abelardo de la Espriella at 44%, against left-wing Senator Iván Cepeda at 41%. The gap has narrowed further in polling since then. Some surveys show it within 2 to 3 points. The runoff Sunday will be decided on margin. The policy contrast is as sharp as it looks. De la Espriella wants to loosen investment restrictions, reduce regulation on hydrocarbons, and rebuild Colombia's fossil fuel export infrastructure. Cepeda wants a renewable energy transition, land reform, and a very different relationship with foreign capital, particularly extractive capital. And underneath both platforms is a China dynamic that doesn't get enough attention in English-language coverage. Chinese mining and infrastructure investment in Colombia has been growing steadily. De la Espriella's platform would likely accelerate that investment under different terms. Cepeda's would potentially redirect it or slow it. For anyone with Latin American commodity or infrastructure exposure, Sunday's margin matters more than Sunday's winner. A wide De la Espriella victory reinforces the existing capital flow thesis. A Cepeda upset, which polling doesn't rule out, forces a significant repricing of those flows.
In Colombia, the question isn't just who runs the country, it's who gets to run the mine.
Speaking of gaps between projected outcomes and reality, the FIFA World Cup is 2 weeks into its group stage, and the U.S. hospitality industry is calling it a non-event. 80% of U.S. hotels surveyed in World Cup host cities reported bookings below projections, according to a Fortune report that's been gaining renewed attention as the tournament progresses. In Kansas City, 85 to 90% of hotels said the same thing. Atlanta saw hotel bookings drop by 83,000 rooms compared to the same period last summer. This is a tournament that FIFA sold as the greatest sporting tourism event in American history. The first to feature 48 teams, the first hosted across 3 nations, the first with MetLife Stadium hosting the final. There are multiple factors at play. FIFA delayed ticket distribution late enough that fans couldn't finalize travel plans before the booking windows for affordable accommodations closed. European bookings to U.S. host cities are down 14%, a number that correlates closely with broader decline in European tourism to the U.S., driven by political sentiment. There's also an accommodation substitution story. When hotels spike prices around mega events, a meaningful cohort routes around them entirely and books short-term rentals. The spend still happens, it just doesn't show up in the hotel occupancy data. The underlying tension here is structural. FIFA projects $80 billion in gross economic output from this tournament. The organization itself is expected to pocket around $11 billion in net profit. What remains for the host communities, the cities that spent years and billions upgrading infrastructure, stadiums, and transit, appears to be substantially less than what was modeled. That gap between what FIFA promises and what host cities receive is a recurring pattern. The 2026 data is just the most recent iteration.
The money machine works, it's just that FIFA is the machine.
Let's stay with things that aren't performing as the models predicted, and this one hits closer to home than an empty hotel room. A new international study published this week found that middle-aged Americans are lonelier, more depressed, and showing steeper cognitive decline than comparable generations studied before, and worse than their own parents at the same age. The research compared middle-aged adults across several countries: the US, Canada, the UK, Germany, Australia. The US results were outliers. Americans in their 40s and 50s are reporting worse memory, higher rates of depression, and more social isolation than the same cohort studied a decade ago, and worse than comparable cohorts in peer nations measured in the same period. The researchers controlled for income and education levels, which means the divergence isn't simply explained by economic stress. What they didn't fully isolate, and this is where honest science acknowledges its limits, are the structural factors that might be driving the US-specific divergence. Smartphone adoption curves, the specific character of American work culture, the erosion of civic and religious institutions, the social fragmentation that accelerated after 2020. Canada, the UK, Germany, and Australia all underwent similar technological and economic pressures. They don't show the same pattern. That makes this an American phenomenon, not a universal generational one. The second-order consequences are significant and slow-moving. Cognitive decline and social isolation in midlife are strong predictors of dementia risk, cardiovascular outcomes, and workforce productivity. If this cohort is tracking materially worse than their parents did at the same age, the downstream costs for Medicare, for Medicaid, for pension systems, for healthcare capacity will be visible in data a decade from now that looks very expensive. This is an early signal in a long curve.
The loneliest generation in American history didn't get there alone.
Moving to attention markets. The creator economy crossed $250 billion this year, growing at nearly 23% compounded annually. That number is significant, but the more interesting number is the one underneath it. Social media creator revenue is up 16% in 2026 to $20.6 billion. Micro and nano influencers, creators with audiences typically between 1,000 and 100,000, now account for 45.5% of all influencer marketing spending. And a quiet but meaningful trend is pulling capital away from the big platforms entirely. The rise of the platform-agnostic creator. These are creators whose primary income streams don't run through any single platform's algorithm or payment system. Email lists, private communities, subscription layers, direct commerce integrations, revenue that doesn't show up in the platform dashboards that analysts report from. The logic behind this shift isn't complicated once you see it. TikTok's regulatory volatility showed creators what it looked like to build a business on uncertain ground. YouTube's ad policy shifts have done the same thing at intervals. Twitter and X's monetization chaos is its own chapter. The creators who've been at this long enough learned that platform dependency is a liability, not an asset. The ones now routing around that model are building businesses that are harder to disrupt from above and harder to measure from outside. That last point matters for anyone tracking digital advertising markets. The $250 billion headline figure probably understates the actual economic activity because the platform-agnostic revenue is genuinely difficult to capture in industry data. The real creator economy may be meaningfully larger than the numbers we can see.
The most durable businesses always end up owning the relationship. The platforms forgot that creators could figure that out too.
Here's a number worth sitting with. Arabica coffee futures are down roughly 40% from their 2025 peak, and the average bag of roasted ground coffee at a U.S. grocery store just hit $9.72, the highest price on record since the Bureau of Labor Statistics started tracking it in 1980. The commodity crashed. The retail price went the other way. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the gap between them is worth understanding. Brazil is the largest coffee producer in the world, accounting for roughly a third of global supply. Its 2026-27 harvest is tracking at somewhere between 70 and 75 million bags, up 20% from last year, a potential all-time record. StoneX projects the global coffee surplus for 2026 will reach 10 million bags, the biggest surplus in 6 years. Arabica futures have already priced in most of that, falling from above $4 a pound to around $2.65. The commodity market moved. The retail market has not. What you're watching is a textbook version of what economists call rockets and feathers pricing. Commodity costs go up like a rocket and come down like a feather. Roasters signed forward contracts when prices were high and are working through that inventory now. Retailers negotiate seasonal pricing, not real-time pricing. And there's no consumer mechanism that forces faster pass-through. You can't buy futures yourself, and you can't switch to a meaningfully cheaper substitute. Coffee is coffee. The tariff layer on imported goods is adding additional friction to the pipeline between Brazilian harvest and grocery shelf. Why this matters beyond your morning cup. If the surplus holds and the commodity price stays where it is, meaningful retail price relief is coming, probably in the second half of 2026, as the new crop inventory starts moving through the supply chain. The commodity market has already moved. The consumer market is running 3 to 6 months behind it. That delay is visible in the futures curve and invisible at the register. StoneX published their retail commodity disconnect analysis this week, and the Daily Coffee News report on April's grocery price record circulated through food industry and commodity circles. A small story with a number that, once you see it, is hard to unsee. Now let's wake up ready. Here's your macro weather report for the week ahead. Let's start Sunday, because the clock is already running. Colombia holds its presidential runoff on June 21st. We covered the race in the previous segment. De la Espriella at 44, Chapeta at 41 in the first round, with polling tightening to within 2 to 3 points. What to watch isn't just the outcome. Watch the margin, and watch whether it matches the polls. Emerging market desks have largely priced in a De la Espriella win. That's the consensus built into recent Colombian peso trading and energy equity notes. A narrow De la Espriella victory is already in the price. A Cepeda upset, which the polling doesn't rule out, forces a repricing that's fastest in Colombian energy names and Latin American commodity funds. The second-order move. Chinese state-owned mining and infrastructure entities, which have methodically built supply relationships across South America, will recalibrate their Colombia strategy within 48 hours of any result. Watch what Beijing says first.
In emerging markets, the surprise does more work than the consensus.
Wednesday, June 24th, after market close. Micron Technology reports its fiscal third-quarter earnings. This is the week's most consequential earnings event, and not just for Micron. Street consensus is at $19.72 per share on $34.5 billion in revenue. Micron guided fiscal Q3 to record revenue of $33.5 billion, plus or minus $750 million. A beat at current consensus is largely expected. Here's what actually matters: the fiscal fourth quarter revenue guidance. Micron has been the clearest real-time indicator of whether enterprise AI spending is translating into actual chip demand. The company ramped HBM3E, high-bandwidth memory, aggressively this year, betting that AI model training and inference deployments would sustain that demand. If Q4 guidance holds or accelerates, the AI memory trade gets fresh validation. If the language around HBM orders becomes cautious, any softness in tone on demand visibility, that's the tell. Watch for whether their guidance language is about growth or about cost containment specifically. Those are very different underlying realities, dressed in similar words. What's already priced? A consensus beat. The stock has outperformed semiconductors broadly this year on AI memory narrative. The market needs above guidance Q4 guidance to move it meaningfully higher from here. A guidance miss, or even inline guidance, triggers a sector-wide conversation. SK Hynix exposed ADRs, NAND-adjacent names, and Seagate would all follow. Memory is the semiconductor sector's most transparent demand indicator right now.
Micron doesn't just report earnings, it reports the state of the AI build-out in a language everyone can price.
Thursday, June 25th, the conference board releases May consumer confidence. This one requires you to read past the headline number. In the last two conference board releases, the gap between the present situation component and the expectations component has been widening. Present conditions relatively resilient, expectations deteriorating. That divergence is the signal. What's already priced? Consumer confidence has been running below the psychologically meaningful threshold of 100 on the conference board index for multiple consecutive readings. Consumer caution is priced across most consumer-facing sectors. What's not fully priced? A crack in the present situation component. If current conditions start deteriorating alongside expectations, that's the early indicator for third-quarter consumer spending softening, not just uncertainty about the future. The consequence that follows: consumer staples outperform consumer discretionary. Small-cap domestic retailers, which carry the most direct exposure to domestic spending and the most leverage to tariff-driven price pressure, are where the repricing is fastest and least cushioned.
Two confidence numbers with the same name. One is what people think about now, one is what they think is coming. They've been moving in different directions.
Also Thursday, new home sales land. Follow it alongside the FHFA House Price Index, which lands Wednesday. The housing market has been in a slow rebalance. Active listings up, prices softening, sales improving modestly. What to watch specifically? Whether new home sales growth is being driven by price cuts at the builder level or by rate-sensitive demand responding to the recent drop in mortgage rates towards 6.5%. Those are two different stories about housing health. Price cut-driven volume is a supply story. Rate-driven volume is a demand story. The distinction matters for homebuilder stocks, which have bifurcated significantly this year between high-incentive builders and those maintaining margin discipline.
In housing, the number tells you how many. The footnotes tell you why.
And Friday, June 27th, the main event. 3 releases that collectively tell you the state of the U.S. economy in a single morning. The final Q1 GDP revision, initial jobless claims, and May's PCE and core PCE inflation data. Start with core PCE. That's the Fed's preferred inflation gauge. Wells Fargo economists expect it at 0.3% month over month and 3.4% year over year. The market's current Fed funds futures pricing reflects roughly 30% probability of one rate cut by December 2026. Here's the specific signal to watch. If core PCE comes in above 0.3%, say at 0.4, that hands Kevin Warsh the data confirmation he needs to begin setting up a rate hike. That language shift at the next FOMC meeting would be meaningful and fast-moving. What's already priced doesn't accommodate a hike. Repricing for a hike from here hits long-duration treasuries first, growth equities second. The Q1 GDP final revision adds a second dimension. If it revises downward from the advance estimate, you get the most dislocating combination possible, a hot PCE print in a slowing economy. That's the stagflation frame. It's the scenario where Warsh's hawkish credibility becomes genuinely costly, because tightening into a contraction is a different political economy than tightening into inflation. Watch for how the bond market reads the data in the first 30 minutes. The 10-year yield movement in that window is the real-time interpretation. My personal watch for this week is Wednesday night, when Micron reports. Not because of Micron specifically, but because the memory market is the cleanest real-time window into whether AI enterprise deployments are translating into actual, sustained chip demand. If the build is real, Micron says so. If the CapEx cycle is outpacing actual inference deployment, Micron's guidance will be the first place you see it. That answer comes Wednesday after the bell.
And that is how you wake up ready. Here's the knowledge bomb. The early career job market is not collapsing. It's mean reverting. That's less dramatic, which is why it's less popular. But it's what the data says. The unemployment rate for 20 to 24-year-olds is sitting around 7.2%. The 25-year average is about 7.3%. So the big scary chart isn't saying the labor market broke, it's saying welcome back to normal. And normal for young workers has always been a little ugly. That's the first thing people forget. The entry-level labor market isn't the same as the adult labor market. It's the economy's shock absorber. When companies get nervous, they don't usually start by firing the experienced person who knows where all the passwords are. They start by slowing the hiring of people who still need training, onboarding, mentorship, and supervision. So early career unemployment moves first on the way down. Then it moves last on the way back up. That's the pattern. In 2001, GDP growth slowed sharply after the tech bubble. Young worker unemployment jumped almost immediately. In 2008, GDP barely had to turn negative before entry-level unemployment surged. And after the Great Recession, the economy technically recovered before young workers did. GDP came back. Corporate profits came back. The stock market came back. But entry-level hiring stayed miserable for years. That's because companies don't reopen the front door just because the economy stops bleeding. First, they work the existing staff harder. Then they restore margins. Then they approve budgets. Then they remember they used to have a campus recruiting team. The young worker isn't the first person invited back to the party. The young worker is the person who gets a text when the party already looks safe. Which brings us to today. The pandemic labor market was the weird part, not this. In 2021 and 2022, the economy went through a distorted reopening boom. Employers overhired, wages jumped, remote work scrambled recruiting, and young workers briefly entered one of the strangest bargaining environments in modern history. Then rates rose. Capital got more expensive, budgets tightened, venture-backed companies stopped hiring like money was free. Big companies started using words like efficiency, focus, and resource allocation. which is corporate for we're not replacing the junior analyst. So yes, the early career market got harder, but it got harder in a historically familiar way. GDP cooled, hiring slowed, entry-level roles got pruned, and the 20 to 24 unemployment rate drifted back to its long-term average. That doesn't make it painless. If you're graduating into this market, historically normal isn't very comforting when your inbox is full of automated rejection emails. But it does change the interpretation. This isn't by itself proof that AI destroyed the first rung of the career ladder. It's not proof that Gen Z is uniquely doomed. It's not proof that white-collar work has permanently vanished. It's proof that early career labor is cyclical, volatile, and always more fragile than the headline unemployment rate makes it look. The labor market didn't go from healthy to broken. It went from artificially tight to historically normal. And for young workers, historically normal has always meant harder than advertised. And that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me for a second. It's 2:17 p.m. in the Wealth and Means conference room. 3 exhausted editors are hunched over laptops, surrounded by coffee cups, half-eaten takeout, and the dangerous belief that local news might save the segment. The assignment is simple. Find something light, something relatable, not another grim recap of world events, just the good stuff from America's local newsrooms. And then it happens. St. George News drops a classic. Highway patrol. Driver crashes into utility pole after reaching for candy that fell by her feet. She reached for candy. The pole won. No serious injuries, thankfully. But spiritually, the whole room stopped working, because this is peak human performance. We have robots on Mars, AI writing code, markets trading overnight, and somewhere in Utah, a grown adult looked down and said, "The Sour Patch Kids are on the floorboard. This cannot wait." At that point, the meeting was basically over. Print it, frame it, we're leading with the candy crash. But local news doesn't quit after one masterpiece. Boston.com had the MBTA general manager accused of pulling an employee's hair, which is not usually how you want transit leadership to make headlines. That's less public infrastructure and more third-grade recess with pension obligations. Santa Monica had a perennial political candidate arrested for grand theft. A man who ran for office more times than most people vote finally made headlines, just not in the brochure-friendly way. And suddenly, our standards were collapsing. We were supposed to be covering wealth, means, markets, incentives, and American enterprise. Instead, we were emotionally invested in whether the best sandwich shop in Arlington is the one with the giardiniera or the one with the Italian beef. Then came Grundy Bank's lip sync battle, which raised $2,500 for charity. That's the local news sweet spot. Deeply wholesome, slightly chaotic, and exactly the kind of event where somebody's uncle performs "Livin' on a Prayer" like he's refinancing a boat. Meanwhile, in Grand Junction, they were telling drivers to zip up. I don't even want to know. Some mysteries are load-bearing. And this is why local news matters. America's local editors are out there every day sifting through city commission swear-ins, hidden marijuana farms, pizzeria closings, transit drama, charity lip-sync battles, and public service announcements that sound like wardrobe advice. And somehow, they still find the perfect absurd gem for the showcase. We walk in looking for inspiration and get reminded that half the country is one dropped starburst away from becoming local lore. So yes, we're leading with the candy lady, obviously. And if anyone asks what Wealth and Means stands for, tell them we invest in moments of pure, unfiltered human dumbassery. With love. Mostly with love. Humor Me. Brought to you by the brave editors who read every police blotter so you don't have to. And a gentle public service announcement. If the candy falls, just let it go. Let it go.
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. 2 lecterns, heavy wood, low light, the kind of room where arguments are meant to last. On the left, a man built for crowds, for the raw machinery of American politics, for the belief that the federal government was the last institution big enough to take on suffering at scale. On the right, a man built for conviction, for the clean sentence that fits on a billboard and lives for 40 years. Neither is here to concede. They've been having this argument for 60 years, and neither has gotten tired of it. Tonight's greater debate begins with one of the most dangerous phrases in American politics. We declared war. Because once you declare war on something, people expect a victory parade. A war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on terror, a war on inflation, a war on anything that refuses to surrender. And in 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson stood before the country and declared a war on poverty. Not a program, not a pilot, not a grant initiative with a tasteful acronym, a war. The question 60 years later is simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker and complicated enough to ruin a dinner party. Did we win? To debate that, we bring together two presidents who never really stopped arguing with each other. On one side, Lyndon Johnson, architect of the Great Society, believer in federal power, and the man who insisted that poverty was not just personal misfortune but a national failure. On the other, Ronald Reagan, apostle of limited government, critic of the welfare state, and the man who delivered one of the most brutal postmortems in modern politics. In the 60s, we waged a war on poverty, and poverty won. That's not a policy critique. That's a tombstone inscription. So let's begin. Johnson opens with the moral case. America is not great because it leaves people alone. America is great because it refuses to leave people behind. To LBJ, the war on poverty was never supposed to be a hammock. It was supposed to be a ladder, not a handout, a hand up. He points to Job Corps, Head Start, work study, community action, Medicaid, Medicare, education funding, civil rights enforcement, all as pieces of the same argument. You cannot tell a child to compete in the American economy if that child starts life hungry, sick, segregated, undereducated, and medically invisible. You cannot tell someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they were never issued boots. Johnson's case isn't subtle. It's moral, muscular, and federal. He says poverty isn't merely a private failure of discipline. It's often the result of public systems that denied people the tools of self-sufficiency. Bad schools, no health care, racial exclusion, regional neglect, local political machines that looked away because the poor had no leverage. LBJ's answer: only the federal government had the scale to force the issue. And then he reaches for the numbers. In 1959, the official poverty rate was 22.4%. By 1969, it had fallen to 12.1%. By 1973, it hit 11.1%. Johnson looks across the table. That's not failure. That's the biggest poverty reduction in modern American history. He argues the war on poverty worked when America actually fought it. Then came Vietnam, then budget pressure, then backlash. Then the program was thinned, redirected, blamed, and politically orphaned. In LBJ's telling, America didn't lose the war on poverty because the strategy failed. America lost interest. Now Reagan leans forward. Lyndon, you're counting the wrong thing. You're counting spending, you're counting programs, you're counting federal intention. But the true test of compassion isn't how many people receive government help, it's how many people no longer need it. That's the Reagan case in one sentence. He argues that the war on poverty misdiagnosed poverty as a shortage of government activity, when in his view, the deeper engines of mobility were work, marriage, family stability, private enterprise, and local responsibility. Reagan doesn't deny that poverty fell in the 1960s. He challenges who gets the credit. Before the Great Society, poverty had already been falling dramatically. From the late 1930s through the early 1960s, strong economic growth, rising real wages, and labor market participation were already lifting millions. The market was already winning the war before Washington arrived to claim command. And then he presses the hardest part of his critique. If the war on poverty worked, why did the official poverty rate stop falling? After the early 1970s, the official poverty rate mostly moved in a narrow, cyclical band, rising in recessions, falling in expansions, but never permanently collapsing toward zero. Meanwhile, spending exploded. A modest mid-1960s safety net became a $1 trillion-plus modern anti-poverty apparatus, including Medicaid, food assistance, housing, tax credits, education support, and direct and indirect transfers. Reagan's cross-examination is devastating because it's simple. If we spent more and more, why didn't the official poverty rate fall more and more? He says the answer is dependency. He argues that welfare programs, however compassionate in intent, can distort incentives in practice. Phase-outs can punish additional work. Benefit rules can penalize marriage. Cash and in-kind support can soften the link between behavior and consequence. A bureaucracy can become more interested in managing poverty than eliminating it. In Reagan's version, the war on poverty didn't cure poverty. It professionalized it. It built what critics call the poverty industry. Agencies, administrators, contractors, advocates, and political constituencies whose budgets grow when the problem persists. Johnson hears this and snaps back. You're confusing the ambulance with the accident. If someone is poor and receives food assistance, the program didn't create hunger. If someone gets Medicaid, the program didn't create sickness. If a mother receives support, the benefit didn't create the low wage, the absent employer health care plan, or the broken school system. Reagan's argument turns the safety net into the suspect simply because it's found at the scene of suffering. The room shifts, and here the debate becomes less about poverty and more about human nature. Johnson believes government can expand opportunity. Reagan believes government often replaces responsibility. Johnson sees poverty as a structural barrier. Reagan sees poverty policy as an incentive system. Johnson asks, what does a decent nation owe its citizens? Reagan asks, what happens when the state provides what families, markets, churches, neighborhoods, and individuals once had to provide? This is the real debate, not whether poverty is bad. Everyone agrees on that. The debate is whether poverty is best fought through federal capacity or through restored independence. Now, the modern evidence complicates both men. Because the official poverty rate tells one story, the supplemental poverty measure tells another. The old official measure is basically a cash income test, built from a 1960s food budget formula. It doesn't fully count many of the modern benefits government now provides. So critics look at the official rate and say, we spent trillions and poverty barely moved. Supporters answer, the measure is blind to the very programs you're judging. If SNAP, housing assistance, Medicaid, refundable tax credits, and other supports reduce hardship but aren't fully reflected in the official number, then the scoreboard is broken. Under broader measures, especially those that count taxes and transfers, the safety net looks much more effective. During the pandemic, when temporary aid expanded dramatically, supplemental poverty fell to extraordinary lows. When that aid expired, poverty rose again. That's powerful evidence for Johnson. Government transfers can reduce measured hardship quickly, but it's also evidence for Reagan. If poverty reduction depends on constant transfer expansion, is that victory or maintenance? Is the goal to reduce deprivation or to produce independence? This is where both sides are tempted to cheat. The Johnson side wants to say the safety net works because it reduces hardship. True. But reducing hardship isn't identical to ending poverty at the root. The Reagan side wants to say the safety net failed because dependency remained. Also partly true. But dependency isn't the same as laziness, and a program that keeps a child fed, housed, or medically treated isn't a failure simply because it didn't transform the entire labor market. So here's the honest synthesis. Johnson was asking, what does a rich country owe to the people its systems failed? His answer was ambitious, federal, and built on the belief that structural disadvantage required structural remedy. Reagan was asking, what happens to agency, habit, and self-sufficiency when government removes the consequences of inaction? His answer was smaller, local, and built on the belief that the welfare state, however well-intentioned, can slowly replace the very capacities it was meant to restore. They're not the same question, and that's exactly why this debate hasn't ended. The war on poverty was not won because poverty still exists. It was not lost because millions of people are materially better off because the safety net exists. But it remains unfinished because America never fully resolved the contradiction at the center of the project. We want government strong enough to prevent destitution, but not so strong that it replaces the habits, institutions, and incentives that help people become self-sufficient. LBJ wanted a great society. Reagan wanted a free society. The unresolved work is building one that can be both. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. In 1949, if you were building a computer, you had a memory problem. Not a metaphorical one, a literal one. The machines of that era stored data in cathode ray tubes, temperamental glass cylinders that required constant power to maintain their contents. If the power flickered, the data was gone. If the tube degraded, the data was corrupted. You could build a machine that was brilliant at calculation, but you couldn't reliably make it remember what it had just calculated. The early computers were, in a sense, very fast amnesics. The problem was hiding in physics, and a 29-year-old man who'd arrived in the United States from Shanghai 4 years earlier was about to find it. His name was An Wang. He'd earned his bachelor's degree in science from Chiao-Tung University in Shanghai in 1940, come to America in 1945 to study further, and picked up his PhD in applied physics from Harvard in 1948. He then stayed at the Harvard Computation Laboratory, the place where the early machines were being built and puzzled over, and started working on the memory problem. What he discovered in 1949 was the principle of magnetic core memory. The idea was elegant once you saw it. Take a tiny ring, a core, made of ferromagnetic material, about the size of a pinhead. Thread a wire through it. Send a pulse of electricity through the wire, and the core magnetizes in one direction. That's a 1. Send a pulse the other way, and it magnetizes in reverse. That's a 0. Read the state with a second wire. And here's the crucial part. The core holds its magnetic state without any power at all. Turn the machine off. Come back tomorrow. The data is still there, encoded in the physical orientation of thousands of tiny rings, waiting quietly in the dark. And Wang received the patent in 1950. In 1956, he sold it to IBM for $400,000. That transaction would be debated for decades as one of the most undervalued patent sales in American history. IBM built magnetic core memory into the backbone of the computing industry. For roughly 20 years, from the mid-1950s through the mid-1970s, it was the dominant form of computer memory in the world. Military systems, banking computers, airline reservation systems, the first real-time computing networks, all running on the principle and Wang had proved in a Cambridge laboratory. And then there's this. In 1969, the Apollo guidance computer, the machine that navigated astronauts to the moon and back, ran on magnetic core memory. The system that calculated orbital trajectories, managed fuel burn, and guided the lunar module to the surface of the moon stored its data in the magnetic orientation of tiny rings threaded with copper wire, each one embodying the principle Mloke, and Wang had discovered 20 years earlier. The moon landing ran on Wang's invention. He used the $400,000 from the IBM sale to fund Wang Laboratories. The company he built would go on to pioneer electronic calculators and then dominate the office word processing market in the 1970s and 80s. The Wang word processor was so omnipresent in American offices that the phrase "doing the Wang" entered business vernacular the same way Googling something did a generation later. He held over 35 patents by the time he died in 1990. He was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 1988. But the deepest thing Wang left behind isn't measured in patents or market capitalizations. It's measured in the idea that information could be encoded in physical states, invisible, persistent, reliably readable. That a machine didn't just have to calculate, it could remember. Every piece of technology that stores something, every phone, every server, every cloud drive, owes something to the principle he found in a tiny magnetized ring in 1949. He arrived in America with a physics degree and an idea about how matter could hold information. He changed what computers could be. And somewhere between a Harvard lab and the surface of the moon, he proved that the most powerful signals are often the ones you can't see at all until you know exactly how to read them. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From a superconductor underneath the surface in Sweden to storage that signals the status of the AI trade, from Ozempic users losing weight and sitting still to employment rates returning to normal, the pattern was simple. Read the second signal, because first principles are rarely flashy.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Till next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.